The Beach Boys with the classic God Only Knows, featuring the incomparable Carl Wilson on lead vocals. I think these days, most everyone who has a serious interest in music is aware and appreciative of Brian Wilson's talent as a writer, arranger, vocalist, and producer of the Beach Boys. But his younger brother, Carl, was rarely in the spotlight, and his contribution to the group, both as lead guitarist and as one of its top vocalists, has often been overlooked. Until now, with the publication of the new book, Long Promised Road, Carl Wilson, Soul of the Beach Boys, by our guest today, Kent Crowley. Kent, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on your show. I'm really honored. So how are you doing?
Well, I'm doing good. I'm always doing good if we're talking Beach Boys.
All right.
As I've mentioned, there have been quite a few books on the Beach Boys over the years, and nearly all of them focus primarily on Brian Wilson. This is really the first time that Carl Wilson got a biography. What led to your decision to write this book?
I have to give credit to my wonderful publisher, Jawbone Press. They realized that we've been without Carl for nearly 2 decades, and it was time somebody did a biography of him. And the reason that they approached me on the project is I had written an earlier book on surf music, in which I had made the point that if you look at surf music cultural expression, then yes, Dennis was the real Beach Boys. But if you look at it as an electronic and a musical revolution, which it was,
right,
then Carl was the real Beach Boy. And it was Carl's ability at the tender age of 14 to play that kind of music, which is a very demanding style of guitar. It was his ability that basically got the Beach Boys in on the ground floor of an emerging musical phenomenon, which they actually later went and completely redefined.
And that's something that your book goes into great detail on. When we think of Carl Wilson today, I think everybody thinks of his voice, you know, that beautiful voice and God Only Knows and songs like Good Vibrations. But people forget he was an ace lead guitarist.
And I have always had concerns about that, because if you take a look at the difficulty and the complexity of the styles of guitar that he was playing, you know, those old surf guitars, the Stratocasters, the
right,
Jaguars, Jazzmasters, they were usually strung with pretty heavy flat wound strings. Again, physically demanding. And then Carl later switched to primarily 12-string guitars, very demanding, but it was the music he was playing that was really making the biggest demand. He was an incredible guitar player, and I think in his lifetime, he was only profiled by, I think, 2 guitar magazines that I know of, one in 1976 and the other in, I think it was 1983. When you look at the way Brian wrote, the chords are constantly moving. His compositions are whole constructs of moving parts. And Carl not only had to play those, and play very different inversions, because that was one of the hallmarks of Brian's playing. He was playing very different inversions of the chords. But on top of it, he had to do lead and harmony vocals in the middle.
This is fascinating stuff. Can you pick out one of the Beach Boys instrumentals that you feel showcases Carl Wilson's chops on lead guitar?
I would have to say that his version of Miserlou, I think it ranks right up there with Dick Dale or Jim May's version. It's a little subtler. It's not as aggressive as Dick's playing, but I think he captured it beautifully, and he captured so many nuances of the song. They're often lost by, you know, idiots like me that use it to try to blow up an amp, you know. At the same time, I think the guitar solo that best exemplifies Carl Wilson is the one that he did on She Knows Me Too Well, which is on the Beach Boys Today album.
Right.
Just a beautiful, tasteful, understated solo that adds so much to the song, never calls attention to itself, but it's perfect. It's as close to perfect as you're ever going to hear. I was very fortunate to have seen probably the vast majority of their Los Angeles shows between Sunflower and 15 Big Ones. And usually in those days, they didn't do a lot of extended solos.
Right.
And probably the only time Carl ever really cut loose and showed the world what a rock and roll guitar player he was when they did Riot in Cell Block 9 and later on Student Demonstration Time. And it was great fun, and he would get up there, and there were lots of times he'd drop to his knees while he was playing and do the solos. And so he had those abilities all the time. And this is one of the points I make in the book. He was much more like a big band guitarist. He was playing very complex music, and he was always making sure that what he played enhanced the song, enhanced the arrangement, and never detracted from it by calling attention to itself.
Right. He wasn't going out on stage with the express purpose of becoming a guitar god.
But having seen him in concert a number of times, I can tell you that he could have if he had wanted to.
We're talking with Kent Crowley, author of the book Long Promised Road, Carl Wilson, Soul of the Beach Boys. And Kent, I'd like to get into a little bit of the Wilson family dynamic. Obviously, their father, Murray, at the helm, but you had older brother Brian, who thought of music and made music with laser-like focus. His middle brother, Dennis, who was a bit of a roughneck, but also musically gifted, as well as Carl, obviously, musically gifted, but more stable and easygoing. It's often said that he was brought in to be the mediator during family disputes.
Well, you know, if you look at Murray, clearly music was Murray's avocation, if not his vocation.
Right.
And basically his jobs were there to support his musical career. And that's why I tried to go back and show that, you know, his involvement in the L.A. music scene really predated the Beach Boys considerably. And all of a sudden, here's a guy who loves music. And again, in the Wilson family, going back a couple of generations, you had some very dysfunctional people there.
Right, yeah.
And music was the one thing that brought them all together, healed so many wounds. And it was the one time that it really made them a functional family. And so here's Murray Wilson, who suddenly has a child who's a musical genius. You know, so a lot of attention was lavished on Brian. And being the oldest son, I think with Dennis, I don't think people ever, like Carl, I don't think people ever really looked to see how gifted those two were, because they were always standing in the shadow of Brian.
Right.
But one of the revelations of the book, and my earlier work, I spent quite a few years with the late great Stan Ross and the great David S. Gold of Hollywood's Gold Star Recording Studios. And as a result, I got to interact with a lot of the Wrecking Crew members on a regular basis and a very informal basis. So I not only heard the stories, I heard the scuttlebutt.
Right.
And a lot of them really impressed upon me the fact that, you know, Murray wasn't as bad as he has been portrayed. He was a very damaged individual, but he wasn't evil. And the fact of the matter is, the Beach Boys were raised in a house where Murray was pretty well woven into the fabric of the LA music scene. You know, historically, we kind of think they just kind of blew in out of the suburbs.
Right.
And that isn't true. They were very well connected. But I think Brian's abilities were so vast that anybody could have been his younger brother and been overlooked.
Hey, you. How come you look so much like me?
Because I'm your brother Carl.
About that Carl Wilson there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, how about that, Carl Wilson? We're talking with author Kent Crowley. His book is Long Promised Road, Carl Wilson, Soul of the Beach Boys. Kent, you mentioned the Wrecking Crew before. Now, for decades, no one knew that the Wrecking Crew played on many, many Beach Boys cuts. But now it's gotten to the point where people assume that the Beach Boys didn't play on their records at all, and the Wrecking Crew played everything. That's obviously not true. And in the case of Carl Wilson, he played with the Wrecking Crew. So, you know, it's a big tangled mess that needs to be unraveled, and I think your book goes some distance in doing that.
A lot of information about the Beach Boys has been affected by the fact the paper trails and the existing scholarship is called into question. There's a lot of documentation from the Musicians Union that's been stolen over the last few years.
Right.
Sometimes letters were sent or invoices made not to tell anybody what was going on, but basically to keep the record company catered until they got the product out there. And you kind of have to start with the most recent history and weigh that against all the previous stuff.
Right.
And I had the great good fortune to talk to John Stebbins, who was wonderful. And he made a very good point. He said, Carl viewed himself as a lead guitar player who sang.
Right.
When called upon. But he saw himself as a lead guitar player. As the role of lead guitar diminished within the band, more demands were made on Carl's voice. And that's when you see him really start to focus on the vocals. Because, when we think of Carl Wilson, we think of God Only Knows, we think of Good Vibrations. And you can go back, it's on YouTube, as a fact, with Carl singing What Did I Say?
Right.
He was the R&B shouter in that band, too. It became very obvious to me that Carl's legacy as a musician had really been subsumed into the overall legacy of Brian. And what needed to be done for Carl, and as I said earlier, a lot of the information on the Beach Boys, a lot of people think that was, Glenn Campbell or Jerry Cole doing all those solos on the early albums. It wasn't. Matter of fact, Glenn was usually playing rhythm on an acoustic guitar on songs like Dance, Dance, Dance. It was to break out Carl's contributions to that music because, as I said, it had been overlooked, it had been ignored. It had, again, Glenn Campbell was getting credit for Carl Wilson's solos.
Right.
And so that's why the book focuses primarily on Carl's musicianship, his contributions as a guitarist, and most importantly, as a producer.
Our guest has been Kent Crowley, author of the book Long Promised Road, Carl Wilson, Soul of the Beach Boys. And if someone were to be interested in picking up this book, I guess they could go to their local bookstore or maybe go to the publisher themselves. Who's the publisher again?
Jawbone Press.
All right, but I'll tell you what, someone right now is going to win this book because we're giving it away. We'll take a random caller at 201 for a copy of the book Long Promised Road, Carl Wilson, Soul of the Beach Boys, by our guest today, Kent Crowley. Kent, have a great rest of your day.
So hard to answer.